Aging and immortality. Two opposing concepts we're all familiar with. While growing old, getting wrinkles, getting white hairs, getting back pains, are all things we see as inevitable. Living forever is something of fantasy, something we all know is unattainable. This is something we can see even in the most ancient civilizations, how humans have a desire to chase immortality. You can see this in the first pieces of literature, in the Epic of Gilgamesh. One of the first pieces of literature ever written, a story about a king and his quest for eternal life. We can see it in alchemy, one of the first manifestations of science, whose main goal was to find a medium for eternal youth. Hell, take a look at religions all over the world, and I can assure you that they are all going to have at least one story about an immortal man. For all of nature, for all of history, aging has been seen as this sort of unstoppable force from nature. However, what if I tell you that soon the things we've only seen in science fiction and fantasy might become a reality? However, before I get into that, I think it's important to give you some important biological background information regarding the mechanisms behind aging. Let's start with the basics. All organisms on Earth are being kept alive by molecules called proteins. You might have heard of it, but here's a more realistic model, a view of an actual protein molecule. Proteins are basically responsible for all functional and structural roles in living beings. So the color of your hair, right? Proteins. Hearing, sight, smell, and touch? Proteins. Even moving around? Proteins. Anything you can think of, proteins are responsible for it. Now, the blueprints our body uses for making proteins are stored in the form of certain molecules, which I'm sure you've all heard of before at some point, called DNA. DNA is made of smaller subunits called nucleotides, which can arrange certain sequences inside our cells that our body can then read to produce specific proteins. This, of course, follows that if our DNA is damaged, then our body won't be able to produce functional proteins, which will lead to all sorts of problems, such as cancer. This is a huge deal due to the way our cells replicate. Almost every cell in our body is continuously replicating itself in order to keep us alive. During this process, our DNA is also replicated, but there's a catch. It turns out that after every replication, our DNA gets a little bit shorter. This will normally mean that only after a few days, our body will be able to produce the proteins we need to survive, which means we have a way shorter lifespan. However, life came up with a clever solution for this. It turns out that at the end of our genome, at the end of our DNA molecules, there are special structures called telomeres. Telomeres are basically repeated sequences of useless information that serve as protective barriers, protective caps to the sequences that actually code for important proteins. You can think of it as something else like the tips of our shoelaces. You can see here, visualize a little bit better how it protects the genome. Now, scientists have determined 9 hallmarks of aging so far. Out of those 9, there are 2 that are of special interest today. The first one is telomere attrition. Of course, even though our telomeres do serve as protective barriers, after many years of our cells replicating, they'll eventually not be enough to protect the rest of our genome. That's one of the ways we age. And the second hallmark is genomic instability. I'm going to briefly touch on that a bit later. Whoa. So yeah, it turns out that the mystery of aging has actually already been solved. And it's probably not like we're thinking of. It wasn't solved by a scientist, it wasn't solved by a super advanced computer AI, and it wasn't solved by a cult leader. It was solved by lobsters. Bear with me. As ridiculous as this sounds, lobsters have actually found a way to avoid aging the same way we do. Even though they do eventually die after some time passes, it is only because they grow too big to break out of their own shell. So the question arises, how do they do it? It turns out that lobsters actually produce a special enzyme that acts on all of their cells called telomeres. Telomeres is able to repair telomere shortening caused by cell replication. This means that their genome will be protected from natural aging. But wait, it gets even weirder. It turns out that most animals, including ourselves, also have the same enzyme. However, it only seems to act in egg and sperm cells, as their action in normal cells leads to cancer and genomic instability. One of the main hallmarks of aging I talked about before. So another question arises. What's going on here? The natural assumption would be that lobsters would age more quickly and would have higher rates of cancer. But it's actually the complete opposite. Lobsters only rarely suffer from cancer. So now this means that they have one or many more biological mechanisms in place that allow them to stop both the mechanisms from aging and the results that would come from stopping those mechanisms. And I think that if we do further research on these beautiful beings, we might actually find the key to living forever, or at least the key to stopping aging. And this is something that outrageous. Some of the greatest human inventions of all time have been made based on solutions already offered by nature. Take a look at the wine industry. The whole wine industry, the whole alcohol industry is based on yeast, another organism that is able to produce alcohol through fermentation. The pharmaceutical industry, they use genetically modified cells to produce the proteins they need to make medicine. CRISPR, even though you probably might have not heard of it, it's one of, if not the biggest groundbreaking discovery made in recent history. It's a gene editing tool that's completely revolutionized the field of genetics, and it's based on the immune system of bacteria. I believe that by looking at nature, humanity will finally be able to break free of its chains and finally conquer the